Welcome each. So lovely to see so many of you. Thank you for joining us. This is the movement MHPSS Hub's 6th Journal Club. We're very excited to be presenting a paper on cultural concepts of distress and complex PTSD. My name is Sarah Davidson. I'm the head of psychosocial and mental health at the British Red Cross and have the pleasure to co-chair this research network with Yasin Duman from the MHPSS Hub and also a colleague, Julia, from the Swiss Red Cross, who can't be with us today. I'm recording the presentation that our colleague, who I will introduce shortly, so his presentation and discussion about the paper, and then I shall stop the recording so that we can have a fully engaged discussion around the content presented. If I could just ask you to put your microphones on mute, please, unless you wish to speak. And if you would like to speak, please put your hand in the air, raise your hand either physically or the one on the Teams, then we will include you in the discussion. I have to share that it is my absolute great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Ferdinand Garoff, who is a doctor of psychology, a psychologist specializing in forensic psychology and psychotherapist. He holds a PhD in the mental health of refugees from the University of Helsinki. He has previously worked as a psychologist at the Rehabilitation Centre for the torture survivors in Helsinki and in psychiatric care for children, adolescents and adults. He's been a member of the psychologist's emergency response team of the Finnish Red Cross since 2006 and is also part of the international emergency response roster of the Finnish Red Cross and on the MHPSS roster of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. He's worked in countries including Denmark, Chechnya, Uganda, Nepal, Sierra Leone and Jordan for various international organizations. And he has selected the paper that he's going to share with us on cultural concepts of distress and complex PTSD. Ferdinand, we are all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for your interest in attending this session. I'll just share my presentation and then check that it shows properly. It's full screen right now, Sarah?
Not quite, no. Now it is, yes.
Okay, now it's full screen. Good. Okay, so thank you for the kind invitation to present this paper here. I presented this journal club. Well, Sarah did a brilliant introduction of me. Maybe I'd mention that at this time I'm a postdoc researcher, part-time with the Swedish Red Cross University and Dignity, the Danish Institute Against Torture, and the Finnish Institute of Health and Welfare. And then the other half of the time I'm working clinically and doing sort of professional supervision, but mostly here in Finland at this time. Now, I chose this paper because I thought it had a lot of important insights about the complex PTSD and sort of cultural expressions and concepts around it. And it's also something that came up when we were preparing a paper on the sort of a Danish validation study of the International Trauma Interview, which is of course sort of related to the International Trauma Questionnaire, which I'll be mentioning later here. And I thought this paper had a lot of interesting findings and viewpoints, which I thought were quite valuable to myself. I have no connection to the writers of this paper, so this is just sort of out of my own interest, let's say. And this will serve as a sort of a starting point for my presentation, and then I'll pose some questions at the end as well. And of course, you're free to comment on any part of this presentation or the paper, but I am not the writer of this paper, so it is worth mentioning that I, of course, can't then answer on their behalf. Now, let me first do a brief presentation about complex PTSD, and this might, of course, be very familiar to most of you, but it might, oops, I think, no, it's here. Yeah. No, sorry, I started from different perspective. Sorry, I forgot. Well, it's important to kind of, when you think about sort of these cross-cultural perspectives, to sort of consider both sort of the universality partially of the concept, like something like complex PTSD, which is supposed to be sort of a universal concept because it's part of a diagnostic category, so the ICD-11. But also then, of course, understand that there's various sort of cultural concepts of distress, idioms of distress, or cultural syndromes and things like this. And sort of working in the field of mental health and psychosocial support globally, of course, these are questions that we do have to address in one way or another. Another one which is sort of comes up, I think, a lot, is sort of, it becomes a bit like some of the old, or I don't almost want to say old categories, but like constructs that have been sort of proposed some time ago, like dividing cultures into individualist or collectivist cultures, for example. They can be quite useful heuristics in some ways, but it's really important to remember that these sort of generalizations are then shaped by various other factors, like, as mentioned here, class, gender, education, for example. There can be generational differences and so on, which then overshadow these differences between cultures as well. And that's, of course, that then applies to sort of when we speak about various populations around the world, or try to address sort of particular needs of certain groups. And these might be very different depending on where it is done. And then there's sort of this idea of emotional acculturation, where it's sort of, if you think about migrant populations, for example, people who are displaced, especially if it's a longer term process, like, does it serve, this is part of the, how should I say, emotional acculturation affects sort of the ability to seek help, for example, in a hosting society, or to sort of, how do you express your needs or emotional needs or mental health needs, are sort of it sort of promotes being able to sort of adapt the way of expression, can be something which then translates into psychological well-being or better health, or improves the possibilities for help seeking, for example. Now, there's one concept which is presented in this paper, is sort of this idea of cultural scripts. And the idea with cultural scripts is, of course, that there's certain cultural scripts about how we express things, or how we express emotions, or how we like seek help, for example, or what kind of behaviors we're engaging. So, for example, in situations when we lose somebody, in situations of grief, or in terms of mental health symptoms, for example. And there's, of course, these sort of normative scripts, which are sort of expectations about how to behave, what is appropriate and approved in a sense. But then you have also this idea of deviant scripts, which is sort of those that sort of are different from the norm, but they can also be sort of fit into a certain norm of deviance, let's say, or difference from the norm. And then you might have scripts which don't fit any model, and then it can be very difficult to sort of find appropriate care or help. Of course, sort of in terms of then in terms of mental health, sort of this is, of course, present in the mental health as well. And they're sort of often, mental health is then often conceptualized as something which is sort of different from the norm, or from this sort of ideally functioning person. So that's sort of just a little bit of contextualization in terms of, like, before us approaching this topic of complex PTSD. Now, okay, so just sort of a very, I think this is probably familiar to most of you, but just sort of as a reminder, if we talk about complex PTSD, we talk about potentially traumatic events, right? So we have sort of, in terms of criteria, if you look at sort of mental health diagnosis, PTSD and complex PTSD sort of demands that there's some sort of potentially traumatic event that we experience. And they're, of course, defined a little bit differently in the DSM and the ICD diagnostic manuals. But typically what is involved is, of course, that it's an event that involves lack of control. It's a negative experience, and often the impact is increased if it's a surprising event, either in the event itself is surprising, or that it's surprising in its impact. And then we have sort of the mechanism here. Of course, we can debate what it's about. What one model, of course, is the fear conditioning model, where sort of we learn to be afraid of certain triggers or like certain types of stimuli. Sort of we learn to be afraid or pay attention more or be hypervigilant about sort of our surroundings, for example. And what typically happens sort of when you develop PTSD is then that sort of these memories, trauma memories, are repeatedly brought to mind sort of automatically in for example, in dreams or nightmares, for example, or in flashbacks or things like this. And in this way, sort of the memory becomes strengthened. Repeated events are more likely to cause this sort of process to happen, and also other stress factors sort of influence this process. So daily stressors increase the probability of developing PTSD, but they also increase the expression of symptoms. So if you have PTSD and then you experience daily stressors, it's more likely that you will then also have more symptoms of PTSD due to the daily stressors. Of course, then the idea is that when we develop PTSD, which involves re-experiencing avoidance, hypervigilance, and hyperarousal symptoms, and then we get to complex PTSD, which is, of course, sort of the addition which comes in with the new ICD-11, where in addition to these previous symptoms mentioned under PTSD, we have these particular symptoms which are called sorry, now I forgot. It's the disruptions of self-organization, DSO symptoms, which are then involve problems with affect regulation, negative self-concept, and difficulties with relationships. Now, of course, one point here is then that this should, of course, be universal, right? If we're speaking about diagnosis or mental health symptoms and things like this, these are supposed to be like universal disease categories. And that then, of course, applies not only to the PTSD symptoms, but also to the complex PTSD symptoms. And as you can tell, sort of we're moving further from, this is my interpretation, we're kind of in applying the CPTSD diagnosis, we're moving further away from these sort of neurological or physiological processes involved, like in development of trauma memories or fear conditioning, towards something which is more sort of culturally structured in one way or another. And of course, that implies certain types of questions or difficulties. Now, so as I mentioned before, the CPTSD diagnosis, then in order to have this diagnosis, you need to have all of the different types of symptoms involved in PTSD, and also all of the different types of symptoms involved in these disorders of sort of these DSO cluster symptoms anyway. So there's sort of of course, sort of when we speak about universal validity, most of the studies have, of course, been done in Western settings, and there, of course, that might sort of omit certain types of perspectives. And also the boundary issues related to, for example, borderline personality disorder can be quite significant. And of course, sort of a personality disorder has a very different type of, or it can have a certain type of stigmatizing, for example, perspective compared to other types of disorders, for example. So these sorts of perspectives can play a role in sort of how we, depending on how we understand these symptoms, also both the treatment and sort of the approaches to treatment and the stigmatizing effects, for example, involved can be quite different. Now, in terms of the negative self-concept, if we look at these DSO symptoms, so the DSO, the negative self-concept, involves a persistent belief about oneself as diminished or worthless. And often the idea is that this then involves shame or guilt due to what one has done or what one has experienced. And then, of course, the cultural framing plays a huge role in this, where sort of how we appraise ourselves depends on sort of what is valued in society and what culture dictates as a valuable person, right? So what are we ashamed about, for example, does it involve how shameful it is for example, that you're not able to work, for example, or are unemployed, or there's things like involving this and this. There might be large cultural differences in this. And also there are cultural aspects in sort of how shame and guilt are expressed, and what situations bring about these emotions. So guilt, for example, has these aspects, but also shame, where sort of it can be shameful to be in certain types of life situations, for example, or questions like honor, for example, or violations thereof can be very deeply linked to the traumatizing effects of a certain event. Also for affect dysregulation, there is sort of this hyperactivation or hypoactivation in terms of this, where sort of you have intense emotional reactivity, but it can also be a sort of a numbing effect, right? The affect dysregulation. And there's sort of cultural differences in what types of emotional states are valued. Sort of are sort of these intense emotional reactions sort of something which are approved of or understood or accepted, or is it more accepted, for example, that you sort of hold back your emotions, or you don't show the emotions despite difficulty, for example, or is it, and here we might of course have sort of large gender differences in what types of emotions it's appropriate to express. And also the coping mechanisms around these are affected by culture. So in some contexts, sort of these negative emotions sort of are expected, while in others it is sort of something which is seen as inappropriate. And for example, in terms of promoting social harmony, for example, where it is important to withhold your emotion in order to promote social harmony, and that's sort of valued, while in other cultures it can be sort of you express your grief, sort of, for example, in powerful emotional expressions, and that's sort of seen as something which is valuable and showing that you do actually care about what has happened and so on. So there's a lot of these differences in sort of emotional expression as well, and what's valued. And then if we look at the disturbances in relationships, it's sort of expressed as detachment and withdrawal from others, typically. And here's the difference maybe with borderline personality disorder, where typically I think the difference between complex PTSD and borderline personality disorder is often understood in terms of these disturbances in relationships, where often borderline personality disorder, or people who experience this, have sort of this intense emotional connection with certain people, or intense relationships, which are then typically leading to some sort of conflicts, for example, or difficult situations, while in CPTSD it's more typical to have this sort of detachment or withdrawal. Now, and this depends a lot on sort of the cultural framing as well, where sort of in settings where you have sort of this, what they call here, sort of low relational mobility, that is sort of you usually stick with the same relationships throughout your life, or that's sort of the expectation. There is, of course, sort of this, how should I say, incentive to kind of like maintain the relationships that exist and sort of take care of them, as compared to other societies where it's more common to sort of switch people that you are together with and seek others, for example, or peers, for example, if you feel that you're not getting your emotional needs met in a certain social group, for example. And this sort of relational avoidance can, in sort of these settings where social sort of connection is expected, can be seen as a disruption of basic cultural norms. But this might, of course, require then sort of a certain type of emotional numbing, or depending on the setting, of course, it can depend on sort of what the expectation is. And sort of this sort of withdrawal, which is typically implied in complex PTSD, is something that might then trigger sort of negative social responses and then lead to further sort of exacerbation of the symptoms, right? So it depends also the cultural expectations around disturbances in relationships, of course, then influence sort of how this category of symptoms is experienced. So in terms of social support, one thing to think about, for example, in this context, is sort of how sort of social support is thought about. So in cultures which are more independent, where sort of it's usually understood more explicitly as something that sort of is sought or elicited or provided in some ways, while in more interdependent cultures, it's often something which is it is provided, but sort of obliquely, in a sense, by being together or providing practical support, but while at the same time sort of avoiding burdening the rest of the network in some ways. So this is one aspect to think about when we kind of measure social support, for example. And the other one is sort of the differences in collectivism or collectivist cultures, is that sort of what is prioritized. Is it sort of conflict avoidance, low arousal emotions, for example, or cautiousness, or sort of not burdening others and so on? Or is it more sort of where you engage more, where it's sort of more about expressing positive emotions together and having social gatherings, for example? So there can be differences in terms of within sort of these kind of categories as well. Then we have a practical question, of course, which I alluded to in terms of the ITI validation study, which is sort of, okay, how do we then measure something like complex PTSD? And typically, I think the most used measure at this time is the ITQ, the International Trauma Questionnaire, and it has been studied quite a lot. And of course, there are sort of cultural aspects embedded sort of in how we measure these things as well. And one of the aspects which is sort of can be seen as a problem is that at the beginning of the ITQ, like in many of the other PTSD or trauma measures, we sort of elicit a traumatic event because we want to identify criterion A, that is the first criterion for establishing a PTSD or CPTSD diagnosis, that something bad has happened. And that, of course, can be something that creates a response bias, which is a relevant point. And of course, and that it in itself can create sort of a certain bias. And then also that sort of DSO items might be linked to others. So you have several studies where especially like affect dysregulation can be difficult to disentangle from hypervigilance and hyperarousal, for example, because there's similarities in that. And that's where we like words like affect and emotion. How do we interpret these words? We had that problem, for example, in translating the Finnish, the ICD-11 into Finnish. How do we translate this affect as emotion or not? And then how do we understand these categories? And what do we call? Here, I think it's really, really important to look at the actual items and their translations when you sort of then try to evaluate these categories. And it's not neutral how we do it, because like if you take the ITQ, for example, there's only two, if I remember correctly, there's only two items that measure each of these categories. And in order to have sort of the CPTSD diagnosis on the ITQ, you should have sort of a significant response on at least one of these two items. And if you don't, then you wouldn't fulfill the diagnostic criteria for CPTSD. A practical problem which emerged, which is not in this paper, which we have, is that there might be this sort of thing where it depends on the level of symptomatology, how people are able to differentiate the symptom categories, right? So when the symptomatology is less severe, the symptom categories are clear, but especially when the symptomatology gets quite severe, it becomes a bit blurred because everything is sort of interacting with each other more like in a network model, let's say. And that might sort of then create sort of a situation where we don't have exactly the same connections between the symptoms as in the construct where you have sort of these broad categories of the PTSD symptoms and DSO symptoms, and then the subcategories of these different, and they don't co-vary in the expected way, let's say. But maybe some of you have more insights into this. Then about treatment adaptation and digital intervention. So of course, sort of this is like a very much developing field. It's not, how should I say, the understanding of what complex traumatization has of course evolved over time from sort of more maybe focused on what the traumatic experience is towards sort of a diagnostic category. And then, of course, how well that constructed diagnostic category fits people in the real world is, of course, a sort of always a question. But there are sort of more evidence around this, and also sort of evidence for different types of interventions. Now, many of the treatment responses that have been developed are, of course, based on like earlier trauma interventions or treatments, but these often require sort of relatively sort of high, quite a lot of both professional skill as well as sort of relatively a lot of resources. And that creates its own problem in sort of trying to sort of disseminate these sorts of treatment models internationally. Now, sort of one approach, for example, could be to this is sort of narrative exposure therapy, and this is just my suggestion, which is a sort of a evidence-based trauma treatment, which has been developed originally in refugee settings, and it's relatively short term, and it has also been studied for in various humanitarian settings, and it can be sort of delivered by non-trained specialists under supervision. Another approach, of course, is sort of different digital interventions. But I'm not actually, now that I think about it, aware of if there's specific complex PTSD interventions sort of for available digitally. But of course, this then creates its own questions about sort of how do you disseminate these, and how do you sort of make sure that sort of privacy is maintained, and so on. And then maybe I had a few words about the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement context. And this is maybe a little bit my interpretation, so please feel free to provide your own thoughts on this. One is, of course, that sort of there is a general commitment to sort of mental health and psychosocial support within the movement globally. But of course, each national society sort of has its very different approach to these topics, and sort of they are differently situated within their own service system and in their countries. And of course, they have very different profiles in many ways. Often, however, many of the MHPSS work that is done within the movement is provided by trained volunteers or non-specialized staff. And this, of course, can be sort of a limitation then for various treatments that can be sort of evidence-based treatments, for example, and other things that are expected to address complex PTSD and other mental health disorders. One particular note is that sort of if you think about the intervention pyramid, there's usually a lack of sort of at sort of services at the top of the pyramid, even in sort of settings where there is a lot of experiences of trauma. I used to work for CVT, Center for Victims of Torture in Jordan during the some 10 years ago when the war in Syria was quite active, and we treated Iraqi and Syrian refugees, and there we provide a specific group-based trauma treatment, but even in that setting, when we kind of reviewed, despite sort of the relatively large volume of service CVT provided in that setting, there was still very, very much sort of more services provided at lower levels of the pyramid. So I think that would be a quite typical situation. So even though the pyramid gets narrower at the top, in practical terms, it gets really, really narrow in many settings. And then, of course, then the question is sort of what do we then do about this? And we might sort of, one thought I had about this is sort of course, it's important to kind of recognize these cultural aspects and recognize both like in terms of in services provided, but also kind of the lack of the sort of I think the sort of the local understanding and knowledge of cultural idioms of distress, for example, or available services and things like this is then something that we have to really also understand as a very, very valuable sort of pool of knowledge and then like let that inform what a trauma-informed approach in a certain setting can mean that can address these sort of complex PTSD related questions. And of course, in many settings, there's no layer 4 or sort of specialized mental health services. And then the question is, what do we do then with this, our improved understanding of these sort of things? I also had this sort of thought when, and this sort of lack of, let's say, this lack of mental health services at that level can, of course, then hinder sort of the estimation of the actual prevalence of these sort of disorders or the need of treatment of these specialized mental health needs. And I don't know, this is more my own speculation, but I have this sort of intuition that sort of sometimes the lack of services is actually what exacerbates stigmatization, because if you have a mental health disorder which is not treated, it is of course likely to become more likely to become worse. And that also means that untreated mental health disorders become sort of the then that understanding of what a mental health disorder is, of course, is what's then evident to people in society where it is left untreated. So that means that if you don't treat the disorders, they also become more stigmatizing, right? So if you have let's say, a psychotic mental health disorder and it's left untreated, I mean, most people can actually live good lives here in Finland where there's a lot of treatment available and things like this. But then if it's left untreated, of course, the perception will become that everybody who experiences this will sort of live in misery and it's something which cannot be addressed, and then it becomes more stigmatizing in that way. So in that sense, it kind of makes sense to, like, that's part of the trauma-informed approach to understand sort of these interlinkages. And then there's sort of this note about the workforce. It's of course important to remember that these cultural scripts are also something which is sort of prevalent among people who are, or sort of these understandings are ones which are shared both sort of in the people being served, but also sort of in staff working locally, and also sort of they often experience the same kind of traumatizing or difficult situations as the people that are being supported. And sort of one suggestion here, of course, is then to try to integrate this sort of or try to address this through support models, such as the integrated model for supervision that has been developed in collaboration with the MHPSS hub. So this is my thoughts here. Should I leave these questions here for you? This is the questions that we raised, and I tried to address some of these questions in my presentation, but I'm sure there's things which I have not addressed.